right, we're ready to go.
All right, today is January 11th, 2022. It is a city commission work session. It's a joint work session with the Historic Review Board. So Mr. Wiley, will you please call the roll?
For the City Commission, Commissioner Frank O'Donnell. Here. Commissioner Denise McGriff.
Present.
Commissioner Brock E. Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Adam Marl.
Here.
And Mayor Rachel Lyle Smith.
Here.
For HRB, we have Board Member Sabrina Ferry.
Here.
Board Member Jessica Belknap.
Here.
Board Member Raven Stobie is currently absent, but may show up in a moment. Board Member Paul Edgar. Here. And Board Chair Grant Blythe is going to join us late, possibly.
Okay. Have we confirmed Jessica and Paul, since you guys are on the Zoom? Can you hear us? Can you hear me talking? Fine?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, I can hear you great.
Great. All right, so I think tonight's agenda item is pretty easy. It's a discussion item. We all received the packet, the memo from Ms. Richter. So, Mr. Ravitch, are you going to kick us off, or Kelly?
I'm going to turn it over to Aquila, and she can go ahead and give the introductions for this item.
Hi, yeah, good evening, thank you. So I don't know if Kelly, did you want to make any announcements or talk about the item, but essentially okay. Thanks. So Kelly Reed, our planner, is going to walk you through a couple of slides and talk about the discussion questions for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Commissioners and Historic Review Board members. Kelly Reed, planner. Just very brief kind of introduction summarizing the Assistant City Attorney's memo and with a few discussion topics and a few thoughts kind of from the staff perspective. We think that the purpose of this discussion is to discuss the successes and the shortcomings of the preservation program, which is basically the body of work of the Historic Review Board and the Planning Department, the design guidelines, and the HRB review process. So there are a few questions that I pulled straight from the memo there, and they're on the last slide, so I'm not going to read through them now. I think the one important thing that we want to make sure that we do during this discussion is not to mention any specific applications, approvals, or denials, even if the decision is final for active, and of course for active applications as well. So a few milestones in historic preservation in Oregon City are included here. We adopted the first historic overlay code in 1982, so it's 40 years old, believe it or not. And our current design guidelines were adopted in 2006, and we're still working with those design guidelines as they were written at that during that year. At the same time, we were adopting codes and guidelines. We were doing historic resource inventories throughout the city, and that means we were evaluating properties throughout the city to determine if they have historic significance. And some of those properties ended up being officially designated as historic and regulated by that zoning code. So we have two historic districts, McLaughlin Conservation District, which has 854 total buildings. 301 of those are designated, that's about 35%. The other 65% are not designated as historic. The Kanema Historic District is National Register District. All buildings in that district are considered designated, and that includes 129 properties. Less than half of those, about 57, are contributing to the character of the district. In addition to the two districts, we have a handful or a few dozen landmarks outside of the districts, sprinkled throughout the city, some up in Park Place, some up on the hilltop, some downtown. And we also have a historic corridor, which is a Barlow Trail corridor up in Park Place. The duties of the Historic Review Board are to review alterations to any of those historic structures and sites, review new construction in the districts, and demolition of historic structures. Those are the type 3 quasi-judicial hearings processes that the board, that is the bread and butter work of the board. Just to give you an idea of the workload, we reviewed 20 of those combined in blue text on that slide. There were 20 applications reviewed in 2021. In 2020, we only reviewed 10. And in 2019, there were 8. So the workload of the board doubled, and more than doubled in 2 years. And I think that's been kind of challenging for a few reasons. And in addition to that work, the board advises City Commission on designation of structures or districts, to review National Register nominations, award preservation grants to local property owners, and there's a big kind of public education and outreach component as well. So the decision criteria that the board uses include the code in chapter 1740. A few examples of what that criteria is and what it sounds like is what is the effect of the proposed new structure on the historic value of the district or historic site? Now, that's very broad. This language tends to be very broad. And then the general compatibility of the exterior design, arrangement, proportion, detail, scale, color, texture, and materials proposed in new buildings. So those are taken directly from the code for new construction in a historic district. Now, in addition to that code, we have the design guidelines. These are they were adopted, meant to be educational for, builders, owners, and architects that are designing new structures, so really they can go through those design guidelines and really understand exactly what we're kind of looking for. Those have been they're referenced in the code, and so they are approval criteria. And there's a guideline for almost every element of a building, the porch, the foundation, the roof, the windows, the siding, where the building is on the site, the fencing, the landscaping, just about everything you can think of. The language, however, is subjective and it's open to interpretation. And the design guidelines really represent a safe harbor. So if an applicant follows those design guidelines, then they can get approval fairly easily. If the design guidelines are not followed, they need to really make their case to the board for why their design is still compatible, even though it doesn't meet the guidelines exactly. So along with the overall activity in general kind of being increased in the last year, code violations have also kind of picked up. And so we're dealing with a lot of, enforcement of the code, people who have done work without review or violated their condition of approval. And so a few things that we can do to address that and address kind of the workload that we have are to consider requiring a formal pre-application meeting for historic review applications, and that's a meeting with staff. Rely more heavily on the design advice process that the board currently has. Ensure that we request 120-day extensions whenever possible to give the board more time to make their decisions. Improve the application forms and templates so that the board receives better quality application materials from the folks that are requesting something of the board. And then, of course, what I think is probably what you mostly want to talk about, I think, is updating and clarifying the design guidelines where needed. So again, those discussion topics that were laid out in the memo from Assistant City Attorney are: how might Oregon City improve and strengthen its preservation program? Is the program sufficiently descriptive, efficient, predictable for applicant use and for implementation by the board? Does the program strike the appropriate balance between owner interest and public preservation objectives? And how do the mandatory 120-day decision time limits impact the historic preservation decisions? And with that, I'm happy to answer questions and listen to your discussion. Thanks.
Does anybody have any comments or questions, discussion?
I think they're waving.
Of course, yes. Well, for those of you that do know me, this program is something that's very near and dear to my heart, primarily because as one of the sole people up here, well, besides, that's not a historic review board member, I do live in a designated landmark. And many of you know that I bought it specifically on purpose. There was a deliberation in my mind when I moved here that I would do that. I felt it was important to, I guess you'd call it walk the talk. So I appreciate the suggestions for discussion. I did put together a little list of my own, as I'm sure you probably expected that I would. And I think paramount to our programs, I think that, you know, thinking back to Kathy Galbraith, and I know probably there's nobody here that knew her except for me, maybe Paul met her, but she was already gone. Oh, you knew her, yes. She was already gone by the time I came here, but everything was in our office, it was there. The thing that I think that we have slacked off a little bit on in the city is more frequent communications. Getting the packet once a year is really good, and I'm glad we've continued to do that, and I'm glad that we have continued to maintain our CLG status, because I think that's important. But we have, just in the time that I've lived here and thinking about now, I think we're on like the third turnover, and it's a good thing that people in the community are talking to each other, because that's kind of how people find out things. You know, they say, oh, I live in a historic house. Oh, well, I live in one too. Oh, do you know about this? And then the conversation continues, which is great. But I think if there was a way to add to our CLG grant funds or matching, that maybe we have the welcome packet, but maybe 3 other times a year we send something out, just, hey, we're still here if you have questions. Then we've got the stuff on the website is fantastic. I refer people to that all the time and send links and those sort of things. The one thing I don't know whether we have been able to do in the last 5 or 10 years, there haven't been a lot of trainings available, but I'd like to suggest that staff get training as well as the board. There are just all sorts of interesting topics out there. There's things online that, unfortunately can't go to conferences anymore. But I understand the trust is going to try to do their conference this next year in Miami, but it depends on COVID. So I may be going or not going. But I think that's critical, and that's something that we had in the budget when I worked here. There was at least some money there was regular planning training, and then there was extra training for the historic review stuff. The other thing is I'd like to know how much we are coordinating with our building department, and they need to have that kind of training too, so that when they're out doing their field work, that they are looking for things to help the planning staff out. And that leads me to my other topic that I talked to Teresa and Aquila about, is that viewing the site is a must. You cannot ascertain what's going on with the building, particularly it's historic, if you only look at it from Google Maps or you only look at it from the front. You've got to be able to see as much as you can see, because the visual thing is super important. But I also agree with what Kelly said about the specificity. When we were doing some updates to the McLaughlin neighborhood stuff that's still coming, we talked about specificity, and I know that not everybody can afford to hire a designer or an architect, and that I'm not suggesting that, but at the very least, material that the staff is getting has to be to scale. And I thought we were already requiring people to go through pre-apps. I mean, they need to come in and talk to staff. And then the other key to the pre-apps, I would totally support having that as a requirement, that you have to come in so that staff isn't taken aback by, what's this application? I didn't talk to you about this. What is this? And then also making sure that, like with the planning, other part of the planning, that they contact the neighborhood association. I've heard concerns from Park Place for, the outside districts, and particularly in McLaughlin as well. They don't generally come and talk to the community, and I think that they should. And if they do come talk to the community, it's been 2 days before a neighborhood meeting and, oh, I got to get on your agenda because I need to do this. I forgot all about it, so making sure people know that there is a regular process for doing that. And that's just part of the list. But I just thought I'd throw that out there because in conjunction with your list, I don't think that for me, the 120-day requirement limits historic preservation decisions. I think it has a lot to do with the board does a really good job in explaining things. Staff does a really good job in explaining things. Sometimes we don't get the applicants that are hearing what you are saying, which I know is very frustrating to staff. And I think the program really does provide a balance between the owner interest and public preservation objectives. I will say I was at a recent event and I heard someone say they invoked sort of property rights comments. And I think we have to be very careful about people invoking that. It's a slippery slope, but we all know that property rights end when it starts affecting somebody else. So, and we all live in close confines with one another in terms of our neighborhoods, unless you're out in the larger property areas. So something somebody does, regardless whether it's HRB or it does affect other people. And I know sometimes an applicant says, well, I'm just trying to do this thing and it doesn't bother anybody. Well, they don't know, they didn't ask. And the program I think, again, the website is very descriptive. I mean, you can find out the answer to just about anything on there. I mean, the city's really ramped that up, and thank you to staff for beefing that up because it's just keep adding to it, and it's just a world of information, which is, but again, it's that communication. By the way, did you know that we have all of these? Just maybe it's a one-pager, maybe it's a postcard, something inexpensive to go out to the people who live in these districts. So that's just, in trying to answer some of your questions there. I think sometimes the board gets put between a rock and a hard place, just like the Planning Commission does. And you want to be sympathetic, but there's the balance. It's the balance between this is what the code says, and we're going to try to work with you on that. And I think staff does a really great job in letting people know that we are here to help you. Staff can't do anything about the people that walk in the door and they already have a chip on their shoulder other than to try to knock the chip off and make them feel like, hey, this is a participatory process. We're working with you. We want to help you do what you want to do, but there might be a little box that you have to be in. So, again, we can't control the applicants, but you guys really bend over backwards to try to work with people. And I can say that from my own, personal experience, having gone through Historic Review Board reviews 3 times myself. They do, it's just how they work, and I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Denise. Others want to comment on the questions or supporting of Denise's, Commissioner McGriff's recommendations?
I'll join in. I don't even want to compare my knowledge to those of my 2 commissioners on the end, but what I see, and in fact, Kelly, if you can call up that one slide, it talks about guidelines and criteria. I'll get back to that in a moment, but I do believe I totally support Commissioner McGriff's comments on training. I worry about those silos where the building department, who could possibly forestall or prevent an appeal by noticing a disallowed feature during the construction phase of the project rather than wait till we get to completion. It would be very helpful to throw the flag at that point and say, no, that's not allowable. So I'm all for the cross training. I'm curious about at what point, and maybe this is for discussion elsewhere, at what point do prospective purchasers of either houses or lots with the intent to build become aware of the criteria, and some might view it as a constraints of building in the historical districts. Much like covenants and restrictions or CC&Rs, they're usually a part of the real estate listing. So that concerns me, because I think the way to get ahead of this is front load it, get on the front and make people aware. I love the possibility of a meeting before you start doing anything, which is a good way to prevent these downstream difficulties. I think when I look at this slide, I don't think it's all that vague for me. I mean, to me, the first paragraph is the effect of the proposed new structure on the historic value. Okay, that might be fairly general, but the second paragraph clarifies that. General compatibility of exterior design, arrangement, proportion, detail, scale, color, texture, materials. I mean, I've sat there and watched that neighborhood group down there be in conflict with itself and watched them try to propose building mansions in there, which were not a fit at all. They look like French colonials. And some of the people there wanted to do it and some didn't. And the rules are the rules. So I don't understand what some would depict as a vague category. I dislike the term guidelines, because guidelines infer flexibility. It's like, yeah, you can do that, kind of, sort of. No. I go back to the paragraph above it. This is what the district requires. You either want this to be a historic district and honor that, or you don't. And if you're moving into that, understand what your obligations are under that designation. So the final thing I'd say is, in my mind, where the city commission has struggled, and understanding there's nights we sit up here and we don't like, where we individually or collectively may not like the law that we have to apply, but that is the framework within which we work. And those things that have come to us on appeal have often been waivers or deviations from described criteria that put everyone in a difficult position. I mean, it's unrealistic, as an example, to say, I've got a feature that's disallowed, but I'm going to allow landscaping to the tune of a 35-foot tree to hide that. That's absolutely nonsense. So I asked that the HRB as a group become well-educated. We've had some turnover. Look at it. I invite their feedback. If they don't like what I'm saying about granting these deviations, and so, well, you can do that with just kind of do this. I know it doesn't comply, but I think this should make it get by. And next thing you see, we're in a appeal situation with city commission. I'd like to avoid those kind of things. So those are my general comments about it. And like I said, I'll go back to this guidelines phrase. To me, puts you in a position where you're basically diluting the verbiage immediately above it. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks. And I do welcome input from the HRB.
All right. So do we have an answer to Commissioner O'Donnell's question? That was actually the first question I had to, are buyers notified as part of the real estate transaction that they've purchased within a district or a historic home or anything like that? Is there, I see you shaking your head of no.
There's no law that requires providing notice. And in fact, title insurance does not provide any warranty or disclosure with respect to land use requirements. So just like you don't know whether you're buying into an R10 zone or a high density zone, it's incumbent on you to go do the research. So that's, I think that the city has a practice of providing mailers after folks buy,
but not before.
But we don't know who prospective buyers are.
I will tell you, Rachel, based on my experience of recent sales in my neighborhood, just in the 4-block area where I live, I would say of the 6 transactions that have occurred over the last 2 years, basically 4 of them did list that it was the blah, blah, blah house. They never really said the words designated, but they inferred. And I tell you, from my time in working in planning, that was one of my biggest frustrations, was dealing with the real estate community who basically would put on their things, that's for you to look up, I'm making a disclaimer. I mean, but the ones that do, we have maybe 3 realtors left in the Oregon City area that specialize in preservation. homes that are historic so that they tell the person right up front, you know, this is what you've got. But the rest of them, no, they don't know. And if they do know, they don't emphasize it. I went on because I was looking for a house for my brother, and there was one near me, a few blocks away, and I walked in. They didn't know me. I didn't know them. And I just said, oh, I see that this, on your thing, is designated. What does that mean? You know, I mean, obviously it was a loaded question. He said, well, you'll need to go to the city and look that up. So I made a little note, you know, but that's kind of generally what you get. It's not widespread.
I'm sure those in the real estate business would not be happy with us if we had signage up at the entrance to these that said these are historic homes and as such must comply with specific rules.
Right. We tried to, about 10 years ago, get a grant to allow the city to do, and the county was going to give us a deal to record on each one of the historic houses that it's designated, a statement that says this is designated. They were going to basically cut us like a $2 a page just for one thing. And we could never get enough money together to do it, because obviously 301 in McLaughlin, and then how many are in Kenema. But it was a great idea. So a citizen came up with that, said, why don't you just have it put right on the, you know, the title? And we were working with the county clerk at the time, and
To me, whether it's covenants and restrictions or you have to belong to a homeowners association, it ought to be part of full disclosure.
Yeah.
And it's probably not the city's role to do that, but you know, somehow that ought to happen, because what happens if you get into a transaction and the person bought a lot with the intent of putting a specific house on, only to realize that house doesn't even come close to complying with the historic standards.
been there, done that.
Yep, I've seen it.
All right, so I guess a couple of other items that I have. I agree, I would support a pre-app conference. It sounds, I think that works well on the land use side of the department, and I know that it's gotten some flack over the years, depending on the topic at hand, but the general goal is to provide guidance and to help people actually comply and do what they're supposed to do. So I generally think it's a good idea to provide as much information up front as possible. Obviously would support education, more education, as we've talked about. I do think, I think about this with the general city stuff. I would love to see like an FAQ, and maybe it's already out there. I have not perused the entire website. You know, something like, when do you need to get a permit? When am I supposed to be going to the city, you know, for something? Because I can tell you as a homeowner, I've been through the process. You buy a house, your real estate person doesn't tell you anything other than your utilities, maybe where you need to get your water and your garbage. And, you know, other than, you know, hearsay, or maybe a lot of people I think have no idea about street tree requirements, about what you need permits for. I mean, I would never know that. And I wouldn't think that I needed to go and look either. So if I had a piece of property, I would say, I hate that tree. I'm going to cut it down. It's my piece of property. I mean, that's just what I would do. I would know. So I think, I don't think we can expect everybody to know all the rules, and I don't think you can expect them to go look. So as much as you can make it easy and, you know, advertise, send out postcards and say, hey, did you know you live in a historic neighborhood and it, or a conservation district, either one, and it requires you to do X, Y, and Z, or something like that. I don't know. Do we have a postcard program? Do we have mailers that we send out?
We have a new homeowner welcome packet that we send out with, when the taxpayer, when the property changes hands and there's a new taxpayer, we get that list from our GIS department, and then we send out a packet. And we did send out last year that packet, not just to the properties that sold, but to every historic property, just kind of as a reminder. But I think that's been the only communication that we've had kind of citywide to all historic properties recently.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciated getting that. A couple of my new neighbors contacted me and I said, did you get your packet? Oh, yes. So thank you.
Last but not least, this may be for Carrie. When I'm reading your memo, it read to me like maybe you were suggesting a refresh of the guidelines was needed. And then I understand DLCD updated their, they did rulemaking to address, and I think it was the owner consent piece, and I think there was a clause in there that said that we changed our code or our guidelines to comply. I felt like there was a little confusion there of like, when DLCD updated goal 5, and maybe that we should do some updates to our guidelines, and then it sounded like in another section that maybe there was the most recent rulemaking, but that we did include what we needed to as part of the most recent code updates. Can you
Sure.
make sure I've got it?
I think there's two pieces. I think there's the need to update the guidelines potentially, and then there's the need to update the code. I think that the purpose for doing one or both of those are different. The code needs to be updated because there are new Goal 5 rules that were adopted in 2017, and they provide a floor level of protection that must be provided to National Register listed resources, so NEMA. And the most specific provision relates to demolition review. It specifically sets forth criteria that cities have to apply when they allow demolition of a resource in a historic district. And the code doesn't say anything about that. So that's one part of why we need to update the code. The other reason why we need to update the code, because if you look at the criteria that Kelly's got there about general compatibility, it talks about general compatibility, but it doesn't say with respect to what are you comparing? What is the compatibility looking at? And the challenge in CONEMA is that we only have 53 contributing resources of the hundreds of resources that are, the hundreds of structures that are there. So if you're putting new construction next to a bunch of non-conforming uses, are you looking for compatibility with those non-contributing structures? No. That's not what we're talking about with respect to compatibility. And that's what we're getting because there are, CONEMA, and what I've learned about it more recently is that it's kind of Swiss cheese. And it isn't a situation where you just look down the street and you see all these, perfectly set back, uniformly sized structures. So I think that I think the code would benefit from amendments that would provide greater description of what compatibility we're looking at. What we're looking at with respect to value. Are we looking at value in the economic sense? Are we looking at value in a aesthetic sense? Are we looking at value in a cultural heritage sense? The code just is not as adept at identifying exactly what the criteria are that we're evaluating, and I think that would help homeowners. The design guidelines piece is a question of just providing greater specificity. If there's only one kind of siding the city's gonna allow, let's just say it outright. If there's only one kind of window we're gonna allow, let's just say it outright. Let's not call it a safe harbor and you can do something else. Let's just say what it is. If we're gonna allow solar, where are we gonna allow solar and what circumstances? So, I appreciate those are big tasks, but that's where I was trying to go with the memo.
Well, and that was what I got. I kind of thought that I interpreted from you reading through there. I know you were providing a lot of background, but it did seem like you were making some recommendations in addition to our discussion items of clearly some ways we can, I think, help us as a city commissioner, because like when Commissioner O'Donnell was saying, it is frustrating to us when it's, I don't need to rehash it, but we all know what we've been through this last year. And so any way we can improve that situation or decision-making and also make it easier for the HRB. The easier it is for you to review something, does it meet our criteria? Yes or no? Can this development, be modified in order to meet our criteria or whatever, make it easier for HRB and for the public. I think that is the staff planned a project, or is this come on anybody's radar as far as scoping out a project to consider for?
I don't believe so. I don't believe that right now in our work plan there's anything.
I'd have no idea what you said.
I don't believe that there's anything in our work plan that identifies updating historic review code. If I could make one more clarification, I actually have a question for Kelly. I believe that we do pre-apps already. Is that
For historic review applications, it's not required.
okay?
And
Thank you.
I tend to have lots of conversations with applicants before they submit an application, but you know, it's a phone call here and there or a discussion at the counter and not a formal meeting where they get a more formal review and back with, the feedback in writing from me.
What is it going to take to make that happen, like tomorrow?
Well, I think we would, we might need to think about our fee schedule. Historic applications, I mean, we could require pre-app, it would be free, or we would charge our normal pre-app fee. Historic review applications tend to be highly subsidized by the general fund, so it's
I know,
$50 application fee. Our pre-app fees are much higher than that, so we might need to think about fees, but I think that nothing else would be in our way to requiring that.
Well, could we, so what I'm getting to is, I realize that there is a fee for the other pre-app. We could make it, again, you know, the reason the fees have been low for HRB for all these years is we're trying to encourage people to come in and file an application. I mean, if we, you know, we can't change the fee schedule, but if we could say as of, you know, this week that we're going to require without a fee till we can update the fee schedule or do an amendment to the fee schedule, it still needs to be something, you know, reasonable. Again, having a house and knowing that if you are doing it, I don't want to use the word right, but you want to make sure you have the right materials. I mean, the cost, you know, sometimes people find insurmountable, so they're looking for a cheaper substitute. And my experience, obviously, you get the cheaper substitute, you're replacing it sooner. So it's all, right now I'm saving up for a project because I know in my, just doing some costs, I'm like, oh, it went up between when I looked at it last September to now, and you know, my hair stood up on him when I saw what the cost was, but I know that I need this type of material in order to make this project work. So it's, you know, it's not anything that's life and death at the moment, but saving up for it is kind of how I've done most of my repairs and maintenance, because everything else on there's lasted 112 years old. So, I mean, obviously, you know, you want to get good stuff, but I agree. I think we need to make them a little more accountable so that they're not putting the staff in an untenable position. And really that's where I'm coming from, is I want to make it as easy as possible for the staff to do their job instead of having it be really hard when people, you know, again, it's that little chip, but make it easier for you guys because it just supports everybody. So getting to your point, we're one of the few jurisdictions besides some in the valley that have demolition by neglect, and we can actually deny a demolition, which I think is, you know, obviously I supported that when it went through the process. We have been very fortunate that we have not had a lot of those types of applications. I mean, very minimally. So most people, you know, they're just so happy to get a house, but yeah, you know, a house that's got some character to it and it's something a little different, not your run-of-the-mill subdivision house. So I think, you know, we have a lot of really good things going for us. And I know when I travel for my National Trust conferences, frequently when Oregon is mentioned, they mention our community, you know, and I'm you know, very proud of that. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I'm an advisor to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I represent the state of Oregon. There are 3 of us that represent Oregon. And so when we're on the national scene, you know, I've got my little Oregon hat on and we get to talk about our programs and things that are going on in the state a lot. So I come, you know, so I have a state perspective, a national perspective, and then obviously the local perspective from dealing with all different types of those levels. So I know that the trust is still pumping out some new guidelines and things that help jurisdictions. I know the Keeper has updated some of their preservation briefs, which I know Kelly has a lot of those, and anytime I go to a conference, I usually bring back an extra box of stuff for you guys because they're just handing it out for free. So I take it for us to, help us in terms of what we're doing. But yeah, I understand that, what you're saying. I don't disagree with, if we're saying we suggest something, we should say, yeah, if the siding's got to be smooth, then the siding's got to be smooth. That's, you're right, that's it. Just go with that.
All right, so it sounds like,
Mr. Morrow has some.
yes, I've seen that. And so it sounds like, I think that would be a good item for, budget discussions. And obviously after OC 2040 is probably off your plate, maybe it's an item for next biennium. But now's the time when we start putting those line items on a whiteboard so we don't forget about them when we're trying to put together our work plan for the next biennium. So I don't think this commission is trying to overburden you or make you worried, but it would be good to see this as a line item that we've got it in our plans to update our codes and, catalog the things now while it's on our mind of the things where we can make improvements and that out. I do want to make sure we hear from HRB members. Commissioner Morrow, do you have something?
Yeah, I just have two quick questions. Thank you, Mayor. So the first one is for Ms. Reed. What is the current onboarding process for new HRB members, if any?
We conduct a legal training with the Assistant City Attorney Carrie Richter, and I do a presentation as well at the kind of HRB 101. I think that is the extent of it currently, and it could use probably some improvement.
Okay.
I'd be happy to, work with other staff to think on additional onboarding procedures.
Thank you. And the other one, Ms. Richter, I appreciated when you talked about the Goal 5 rule requirements. You also talked about other changes that could happen that are more at the top of our minds now than when these guidelines were written. So with that in mind, I think this would again be for Ms. Reed. Thinking of conservation, in a historic district or a conservation district, what would the rules be regarding something like the installation of a solar panel in on a historic building?
We have two applications in right now for that, so I don't want to really speak too specifically. Those are going to be on the HRB agenda for this month, but there are actually, there's a lot of guidance from the national, from the National Park Service through the Secretary of State, Secretary of Interior standards, and there are numerous topics specific topics like solar panels, one of them. And so whenever we get an application in where we don't have a specific guideline that addresses that, then I look to the National Park Service guidelines, and that's very informative, and I think helpful for the board to make a decision and kind of compare it to other examples across the country, the other jurisdictions have made and what's been seen as appropriate. So, I mean, I can speak specifically to solar panels, but, there is some guidance out there at the national level.
But the more local types of guidelines you'd say are not as present.
Correct. Yeah, we don't have any specific, if the application rises to the level of historic review board review, because the panels are going to be visible, and they're not on the back. If they're on the back of the house, we actually have a policy that says it can be approved without board review. If they're on the, a street-facing roof plane, then the board reviews that, and we use our general criteria for alterations,
okay.
And none of those criteria are specifically about solar panels.
Okay, that makes sense. And yeah, just using solar panels as an example. I was just, more curious about general advances that we've had since the writing of these guidelines. So that makes sense. Thank you.
All right, Sabrina, do you have anything you'd like to add? Since you're here, I'll call on you.
I don't think I have anything to add to the discussion.
Jessica, do you have anything that you want to add?
Just not anything new really, but I'm definitely in support of some pre-application consultation happening for people who are looking to go through the Historic Review Board process. I would also really like to see more education upfront for home buyers or maybe realtors who are selling in this area. There seems to be a lot of confusion or gray area, or I don't know if it's on purpose or not, but what's being told to homeowners on what they can do with their property when they purchase a designated structure. So those are two of the biggest things that I've heard from neighbors and friends. So that's my part.
All right. Paul?
Yeah, a point of clarification I would like to have really in 2017 or that period, an appeal was taken to the
DLCD.
Appealed up, and in that appeal, the LCDC came back and said our building guidelines are mandatory. That was according to Attorney Jim Nacita, who represented that appeal to the LD. I got it.
It's a LUVA call. LUVA.
Okay. Was that an incorrect statement that our building guidelines are not mandatory?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I think that's for you, Ms. Richter.
There you go. There's the beach ball.
So the design guidelines are a criterion under 1740. They are listed as approval criterion. The caveat to that is the language of the guidelines themselves are not worded in some ways to suggest that they are mandatory. They were written to not be mandatory. So they have language about safe harbor, as Ms. Reed mentioned, and that you can deviate if you have some different need. And so that is confusing to applicants because the introductory provisions of the guidelines talk about safe harbor. And that is not what an approval criterion means. And so, again, the language could be cleaned up to eliminate the confusion.
If the LCDC said that in a court ruling said that they are not mandatory, wouldn't they be mandatory because they come down from that position?
They are mandatory to the extent their substance says they're mandatory. I'm not disagreeing with you that they are mandatory. What I am saying is that there is wiggleness in the language of the guidelines themselves.
Is that a specific legal term?
Wiggleness.
Yes, okay. I was thinking about Ed when you said that.
I would really like to see a kind of a follow-up on that to make sure that we're doing. Another thing in the building guidelines, we were supposed to be doing this last year. One of our goals was to do some minor touch-ups. And one of the things was to try to maybe make a surgical change to the building, to the design guidelines, which really put bulk or size limitations in real and easy to read numbers. So the attempt was to say that if a cottage home is in Kanema is on average 1,200 square feet or less, and somebody builds one at 5,000 square feet, we're saying, well, and it's subjective, how can we make those things get to a point where we can say, okay, 2,000 square feet cottage or a house is in comparable to Kanema buildings, which we're supposed to be doing. Anything greater than that is not acceptable. And I think that we need to go through a lot of our design guidelines in our codes and really add that type of identification, much like what has been talked about for windows, siding. We gotta eliminate the degree of subjectivity that right now has been opening up Pandora's box. And maybe we need to go through in a work session right with the HRB and the city attorney and maybe some of you from the city commission and just read through and make sure that we have identified things that should be clear and understandings. Because right now, the subjectivity has been a problem, at least in my opinion. And I hope that we could eliminate some of that and just, in a sense, follow the code, do what the code tells us to do, and help interpret that to anybody that comes before us.
Yeah, so I think that goes back to the code changes or the code updates and the design guideline updates. And if you open that Pandora's box, it's hard to open up just a piece. So it would be good. No, that's not something that you do lightly, so I'm sure staff would have to give that some thought as to a strategy of how you'd get started. I mean, I agree with Paul. Obviously, the HRB is a bunch of resources, and they could work together and probably do some drafting of, come up with some proposed changes and assist in the process. I'm sure they would love to do that whenever they're not busy hearing applications and stuff. All right, so we are out of time.
I just wanted to add one more thing.
If you can keep it short.
I will keep it short. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Sabrina, but I'm going to ask, did you have any comments about any of the things we said? Do you concur with them, or you think that what we said was just off the wall, or, you know?
My only concern really is making the design guidelines so specific that there isn't any sort of room for new products that come onto the market, or, you know, perhaps a homeowner can't afford, you know, a particular type of window, but their windows need to be updated or replaced or whatever. So, I mean, I think that there's a danger in blocking things down too tightly. You know, I mean, I know that there are specific products that we always sort of push people towards. But, I mean, I think that's the whole point of the board, right, is to have these discussions and to present things and, consider them in real time as opposed to, because, I mean, you know, 10 years from now, that product might not be available that we want, and then we have to go through and rewrite the design guidelines again. I mean, that's my only concern with that.
I would say, based on what I know about the feds, they are always testing these products, which is why I'm on their website all the time looking to see what they say about those things. Some of them, they say, yeah, this is claiming it's X and it's not, you know, so we want to be careful about making sure that we research those. And so, but thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right, and with that, thanks to staff and Ms. Richter for coming in and giving us this presentation and educating all of us and letting us provide comments and feedback on HRB topics. All right, and thank you to HRB for joining us this evening. It was good to see you with us. I know we like to rule the microphone and monopolize the conversation, so we're sorry that I was hoping that you guys would start waving if you really had something to say. So I'm glad you were here and participated. And with that, we are adjourned.